All right, everyone, welcome back. So we're going to kind of wrap up the story of the Arab-Israeli conflicts. We talked about the birth of the state of Israel. We talked about a lot of the wars in the last couple lectures. We talked about everything from the 1948 war all the way until the Osiris story. So we're going to kind of talk about what happens after that from 1981, kind of moving forward. So a lot more important stuff to cover in this lecture. So just as a reminder, right, as we talked about in the last lectures, that Israel, as a result of the 1967 war, had acquired the entire area of Gaza, West Bank. They acquired the entire Sinai, although we also discussed how they gave back the Sinai Peninsula during the Camp David talks. And so the two areas that we really going to focus on the most in this particular lecture is the West Bank, what you see in green on this map, and in Gaza, what you see primarily in blue on this map. And by now, this was after 1949, what you're looking at this map, but after 1967, by then that entire area is now controlled by Israel, right? So now it's been conquered by Israel, it's controlled by Israel. And as we talked about, this area also had a large population of Muslim Arabs who identify themselves as Palestinians. And so what's going to, of course, happen is that the Palestinians say, well, we don't want the Jewish people here. We want our own state. Where, of course, it's a struggle is what they define as the state of Palestine. Most people in Israel to this day are perfectly fine with a state for the Palestinians, as long as it's defined in the West Bank Gaza area. If they start to define Palestine as everything from the Jordan border of Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, well, that's not going to happen. The other issue that has created a lot of, so that's one of the issues that's made this a struggle, right? It's that the core of the Palestinian demands since as this whole issue began was that they want the entire territory. It's literally what's in the Palestinian Charter, if you ever go and read that. And so, that's one issue. The other issue that makes this difficult is between 1967 and current times, Israel has controlled this real estate, right? They took over the land, they won it in wars. What have they been doing? Well, in some of these areas, they have been building up settlements, right? They've been building up a whole assortment of settlements. And what are settlements? They're villages. So they're villages inside what was this predominantly Arab communities. And so these settlements, very often inside Arab land, right, in various regions here, are areas that the Arabs and the Palestinians do not like, right? They don't want any settlements there. They not only want the area of Palestine, they don't want the Israeli settlements there either. And from Israel's perspective, is like, well, we won this war, it's our land, we could do what we want with it right now. So that's where you get into another issue that's going to have to be solved if you're going to end up a kind of a situation to figure out what to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of the Palestinians. So as we get into the 1980s, this very important individual enters the kind of storyline. It's a man named Yasser Arafat. I don't know how familiar you are with him. He becomes the leader of the PLO. Remember, this is the same organization that in 1972 did the Munich massacre of the Jewish athletes. Yasser Arafat probably wasn't even born in West Bank or Gaza. We believe he was actually born in Egypt. But he was the one who led the PLO for their desire to, again, not only control West Bank and Gaza, their official position is we want the entire land. And of course, Israel wasn't going to give in to that. And what ends up happening starting in 1987 is the Intifada. Now, the Intifada literally translates to like the shaking off. And what is this? Well, this was when Yasser Arafat organized multiple terrorist attacks where he would encourage young men to go from the Palestinian territories, West Bank, Gaza, into mainland Israel, into Tel Aviv. And they would strap bombs onto themselves. They would go into buses. They would go into coffee houses and they would blow themselves up. These were the homicide bombings that had taken place. Remember, this is way before, we think of terrorists and things like that. We think 9/11. This is way before 9/11. So obviously, this is just going to antagonize Israel even more. I mean, imagine sitting in in a bar or sitting in a restaurant or going on a bus, and somebody literally blows it up. And this intifada that was taking place led to a number of people being killed. Of course, Israel didn't just stand back and take it. Israel in 1987 was very aggressive fighting this intifada. They arrested like 11,000 people. They hunted down a number of terrorists, killed about 150 terrorists, arrested 11,000 people in the West Bank, Gaza area where these terrorist attacks are coming from. And so by 1987, this thing was clearly getting out of control, right? Now you're dealing with some, serious issues day in and day out. And Arafat was the one who promoted most of these terrorist attacks. We're going to talk more about him a little bit later as we go on with the story. And I don't know again how familiar you are, but I think it's pretty fair to say there are very few people who have done damage to the Palestinian community more than Arafat. I mean, the reality is, if you think of the Palestinians, they're people. They deserve a homeland. They deserve a place to live, to be their own. But people like Arafat were the ones who made it much harder for the Palestinians. In fact, at one point, they're going to get tremendous amount of money, Arafat will. And instead of using that money to help the Palestinian people, he's using it for himself, for his wife, living a lavish life in France, and kind of all these stories that we now kind of eventually realize that Arafat never really, I think, had the best interest of the Palestinian people at heart. And that's unfortunate because, of course, the Palestinian people, just like the Jewish people, want a homeland, right? And a place to have as their own. So that's going to be important as the story continues. So, as things were getting out of control, there was now a movement to start some peace with the Israelis and the Palestinians. And this actually began under President Bush the older, right? Not the younger President Bush, the older President Bush. So, we were talking about, circa 1990 period of time. And at this point, the Secretary of State of the United States was a man named Baker. And Shamir, that was the prime minister of Israel. So President Bush is sending his Secretary of State Baker to talk to the prime minister of Israel. Of course, the United States and Israel have very good relationships, and they're trying to say, hey, is there some way you can make peace with the Palestinians? Is there some way we can deal with this? And of course, Shamir's attitude and the attitude of Israel is, how do we make peace with people who are, putting bombs on buses and blowing up our women and children on purpose, right? And when Israel tries to retaliate to try to stop them, they literally go out of their way not to hit civilians, and the PLO are going out of the way to hit civilians. And so Shamir is like, what do you want us to do? And so there were some discussions and some talks. What eventually is going to happen is pressure is going to mount on Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat eventually is going to take a position where he says, okay, I will encourage less terrorist attacks if you, Israel, are willing to help us get parts of West Bank and Gaza. At least that was the initial discussion. So there was enough pressure to at least make him say those things, Arafat say those things. Does it mean it or not? Well, let's see how this story unfolds. So that was in like early 1990s. Then we get to 1993. So we jump ahead a couple of years. By then, President Bush the older had lost the re-election. President Clinton had become the new president of the United States. In Israel, they had a new prime minister, a man named Yitzhak Rabin. I'll show you a picture of him in a second. Yasser Arafat was still, again, the leader of the PLO. And by 1993, Arafat had started to at least talk about mitigating some of these terrorist attacks. However, even if Arafat himself says, let's have less terrorist attacks, the military wing of the Palestinian Hamas never agreed to that. And Hamas would continue these attacks. So Hamas was the kind of the most militant wing of the PLO. Despite that, there were these talks taking place in Oslo. And by 1993, there were these very famous Oslo Accords, where Clinton and Rabin and Arafat met. These were actually secret talks. People didn't even know these things were happening in 1993. They were very quietly done, and Rabin and Arafat would meet, and Clinton I don't believe he was there in every meeting. I don't know if it was any meetings, but, obviously his foreign policy team was there. And they met, and all of a sudden in 1993, they come to an agreement, a pretty big agreement. And you have this really momentous moment. And what you have in this moment is this very famous picture. And this is a picture in 1993 after the Oslo Accords of Yitzhak Rabin. So there's Yitzhak Rabin you can see over here, right, on the left. Here's Clinton in the middle, and this is Yasser Arafat on the right there. And they come to an agreement. What do they agree to in these Oslo Accords? Well, I'm going to go through what they agreed to in a second, which you do want to know. But this photo is interesting because if you ever go and watch the footage of it, and sometimes in class I actually go and bring up the footage and show it's a little long, so it's hard to find the exact moment. But the way it all worked is they signed the paperwork, and Clinton goes to Yitzhak Rabin, shakes his hand, goes to Arafat, shakes his hand, and then he kind of has to pull them together to shake each other's hands because Yitzhak Rabin had no desire to shake the hand of Yasser Arafat. Yitzhak Rabin was this old hawk, right? In Israel, there are hawks and there are doves. The hawks are the ones who, we got to fight. We got to, not give an inch because if we give an inch, they're going to take a mile and they're going to, keep trying to come after us. And then there are the doves in Israel say, well, if we just be nice and give them land, they'll leave us alone. And Yitzhak Rabin was historically a hawk. And he was the one who said, you know what, I don't want to keep this blood flowing. We need to find and make a peace. And if Yasser Arafat is really willing to stop these terrorist attacks, I'm on board. So what do they agree to? So these are the points that I want you to know from the Oslo Accord. Number one is the PLO needed to denounce all terrorist attacks. Okay? Number two, they had to use all means to stop those terrorist attacks, right? So the PLO had to use all means to stop those terrorist attacks. In exchange, Israel would begin to pull their troops out of Gaza and West Bank because Israel had troops in Gaza and West Bank. Those were territories they've had since 1967. And they said, we will move our troops out of Gaza and West Bank, and we will begin to allow self-governing to the Palestinians. In other words, we'll let the Palestinians govern themselves in West Bank and Gaza, right? With the eventual goal of complete statehood for that nation, right? And so that was the agreement. Those were the key points in the Oslo Accord. Again, so make sure you get them down. That the PLO agreed to stop all terrorist attacks, use every means to stop those terrorist attacks, and that in exchange, Israel would move their troops out of West Bank and Gaza, would give the Palestinians self-autonomy, kind of self-governing rulership. They wouldn't be officially a state right away, but there would be discussions to make it eventually an independent state. So this was this momentous moment, right? But one thing they didn't do that's still important is they didn't hammer out the specific borders because, again, those settlement issues, right? And so Israel will pull out of the quote-unquote West Bank and Gaza, but those lands weren't defined. They didn't define, okay, well, from this point and this latitude and this longitude, we're pulling out, and from this is part of Israel, this is part of Gaza, this is part of West Bank. Those specific lines, there was some, gray area here that they didn't work out yet. So there was still more work to be done, but this was seen as this historic moment. And look, I remember as a young man, watching this and knowing the whole history, and I was like, wow, we're going to actually have peace here, and everybody was happy, and it was really a momentous moment. Unfortunately, it's not going to be as good as it was. One other key point, lots of money. That Arafat was given tremendous amount of money by the United States at this point. And he was supposed to use that money to stop the terrorist attacks and build up schools, hospitals, build up all the things inside of the Palestinian communities to better their lives. That was part of the deal as well. All right, what happens? Aftermath of Oslo. So one unfortunate thing that happens that we do need to talk about, shortly after the agreement, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. He was actually assassinated by an extreme radical Jewish person who did not want this peace treaty. This man assassinated Rabin. It was an incredibly tragic moment in Israeli history. It's often been described as kind of the JFK of Israeli politics because Rabin was very popular at this point. He was very well liked. And this was really resonated hard for everybody in the Jewish community. In fact, when the funeral of Yitzhak Rabin took place, I think there were five former U.S. presidents who attended his funeral. And so it was a pretty, powerful and sad moment that took place. So that's one key thing that happened. So you could see, yes, they're extremists on both elements of this story. Of course, the difference is, if you remember when Sadat was assassinated, much of the Islamic world cheered it. When Rabin was assassinated, there was almost no one in the Jewish world that cheered his assassination. It was basically universal sadness. Despite his assassination, the Oslo Accords held. Israel accepted them, and they did pull their troops out of West Bank and Gaza. And as they begin to pull their troops out, they still need to work the final borders. So we get to 1998. 1998, there's another conference. Now, by now, this is President Clinton's second term. In 1998, he's President of the United States. Netanyahu was the Prime Minister of Israel. And yes, Netanyahu, some of you might be familiar with him. He was Prime Minister of Israel, then he wasn't Prime Minister of Israel, then he becomes Prime Minister of Israel again. That's actually not as uncommon in Israel and other countries. In the United States, usually if somebody's president, they don't come back and become president 10 years later or 20 years later, but that did happen with him. And Arafat is still leading the PLO. And at the Y conference, they're going to have to kind of try to hammer out a few other key points. So what are they going to hammer out at the Y conference? So at the Y conference, it wasn't as dramatic, but they did talk about like opening up an airport in the West Bank area, so the Palestinians have an airport of their own there. They had talked more about a final agreement to create a Palestinian state. And the Palestinians were also supposed to change their official charter so they wouldn't define Palestine as this entire region. Remember, this is one of the big sticking points. What do they define? If you go back and you read the Hamas covenant, how do they define it? They define it as an entire area. So that was supposed to be changed. So there were little things there, and more importantly, they said, we're going to keep meeting, right? That's probably the most important thing that happened in Y conference. The airport's important. More pull out of troops is important, right? The idea that they're going to have a state is important. But the key thing is we're going to meet. We're going to keep meeting to hammer out an official state for the Palestinians. 2000, Camp David. Now be careful because it was the 1978 Camp David talks. It's the 2000 Camp David talks. Clinton is president of the United States. This is the very end of the Clinton administration. Ehud Barak, I'll show you a picture of him in a second. He was the prime minister of Israel. And remember, I said there were hawks and doves. This guy was the ultimate dove, Ehud Barak. Barak wanted to make peace at all costs with the Palestinians. He wanted to put this issue to bed once and for all. And Arafat is still the leader of the Palestinians. So in 2000, Ehud Barak says, let's give the Palestinians not just self-governing, but an official state. We will pull, and we've already pulled all the troops out. By then, the troops have been pulled out. In terms of the land Israel is willing to give, we will give the Palestinians 95% of the land of the West Bank and Gaza area. Why not 100%? Well, because of those settlements I mentioned before. And Ehud Barak said, well, now at this point, there are settlements here, right? It's a village. And we're just not going to, put this village fully of Jewish people who've been there for now a generation or two and say, okay, you guys have to be part of this new Palestinian state. So we do want those areas still maintained as part of Israel. But everything else you can maintain. And, most people at the time observed this and thought, wow, this is about as good a deal you can offer. Full statehood, 95% of the territory. What's the problem? Well, Arafat sees this deal, looks at it, and walks away. And the person most furious was President Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton, this guy was like, remember by now, you know the story of Bill Clinton, of course, the Monica Lewinsky affair. He wanted a legacy. And what better legacy would there be to bring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians? If you can bring peace between Israel and an Arab neighbor, that's a pretty good achievement. And so that's what he wanted to do. And he couldn't do it. He was so upset. And Arafat just walked away. And not only did he walk away, after he walked away, he started what was called the Second Intifada, where there were more attacks, more suicide attacks. It was a horrible thing called the Passover Massacre in 2002, and everything just fell apart very quickly. So people have wondered why. Why did Arafat not, why didn't this just end? They were right there. They could have made this peace. And, there have been different theories on this. Some people have stated that, Arafat was really never into the peace. He was doing this for the money. Other people have speculated that if Arafat made that full peace with Israel, that maybe what happened to Sadat would have happened to him. At the end of the day, he just didn't agree to this. And as a result, you get the Second Intifada, which is more attacks. And Israel now is pretty much fed up. And what Israel is going to do after years of these attacks, and then, trying to have this peace, willing to give land again, right? Again, the fact that Israel was willing to give up any of this land is unusual in history. They won this land, they won in a war. Theoretically, they don't have to give any of it back, but they did. And they were willing to do it again. But, Arafat said, no, not good enough. So what's going to happen? Well, you have this Passover massacre, and things are about to dramatically change again. This is Ehud Barak. He looks like a nice, sweet guy. Even his picture, he looks like, just a sweet little guy. He's the dove. Well, after the Second Intifada, there's an election in Israel. He loses. Not a surprise. The people in Israel are like, what, this didn't work. And we're being attacked. And Ehud Barak is soft. We need somebody strong. And who did they elect? This guy, a man named Sharon. And his approach was a lot more hawkish. In fact, I think you can argue he's probably the most hawkish of all the Israeli prime ministers at this point. And Sharon said, we're done. We're just done. We are no longer negotiating. We need the terrorist attacks to stop. We're going to build a wall between the Palestinian territories and Israel. We are going to make sure that no Palestinians are able to go from the region of the West Bank, Gaza into Israel unless they are thoroughly checked, vetted, and so forth. Right? And if you try to go through, we're just not going to let you. We're going to suffocate your ability to attack us. He took very draconian measures. If there was a terrorist attack against Israel, what he would do, Sharon, and so let's say somebody from West Bank or Gaza attacked Israel. There was a terrorist attack. He would figure out who that person was. Obviously, that person would be dead. These were often suicide attacks. And Sharon would actually go to the family who did this, the family who was part of it. So let's say somebody's son committed a terrorist attack. He would go into West Bank, Gaza, wherever they were, knock on their door and say, your son has just committed a terrorist attack. You have 30 minutes, an hour, take all your possession of the house. We're bulldozing your house down. So again, one of the things that I think is important when you tell these stories is you have to always give the full story. People, of course, criticize Sharon for this. They're saying this is too draconian, too brutal. Sharon's idea is, we're not going to stand for any of these attacks. And remember by now, this is after 9/11. President Bush the younger is in office. Israel is not going to go to Sharon and say, well, you're being mean, you're being too harsh, when right after 9/11 we were attacked in a massive terrorist attack and we invaded countries. We dropped, massive bombs because of the attack we faced. And so how is the United States or any country after 9/11 going to tell Sharon, well, you're being too mean, right, or too harsh? But that was the approach. And this approach did stop the Intifada attacks. You're no longer going to have these suicide attacks. Now, it's not the end of the conflict, because even though he's able to stop the young men from going into Tel Aviv and blowing themselves up in bombs, that doesn't happen anymore. Other things happen that continue the fight between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Before I get to that, eventually Yasser Arafat dies. He is going to be replaced by a man named Abbas. He's got a new movement called the Fatah movement. They're supposed to be more moderate initially, that they would, try more to have a peace again with Israel. And then Fatah and Hamas become kind of two different factions for a while for the Palestinians. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they oppose each other. So there's kind of this whole internal conflict within the Palestinians between Fatah and Hamas as well. So Abbas, he's the one who ends up becoming kind of the very vocal leader of the Palestinians after Yasser Arafat dies. So then there's some other key issues. So now what, right? What ends up happening? So Sharon does this thing. He builds these walls, to keep the terrorists out. This peace is still unresolved, and so what you have now is West Bank and Gaza. You don't have Israeli troops in there. Israel doesn't really want it. The people in West Bank and Gaza are almost two different groups now, right? It's not as even though there's one united, West Bank, Gaza kind of Palestinian state. They're almost each independently governed. Because they can't do the suicide bombings, they've resorted to rocket attacks. And so now they, when there's moments of tensions, rockets will rain into Israel from the Palestinian territories. Sometimes hundreds of rockets will start raining in to Israel. And, you can try to imagine if you were living in a city and hundreds of rockets were running in, what would you do? Israel has created a modern defensive system called the Iron Dome, which should stand a lot of these rockets, but of course, that's not enough. And so Israel has to oftentimes go into these areas. They have to find where these rockets are launched from. And I've actually been in Israel once during one of these rocket attacks when they were taking place. And I could tell you what Hamas does is horrendous. They don't just fire rockets into Israel. What Hamas does, these rockets are mobile rockets. So they get into a Jeep, right? They get into these Jeeps. They fire a rocket just randomly into Israeli territory. The Israelis see this. They get in their helicopters. They're going to get and try to get this Jeep of Hamas terrorists who are firing rockets into Israel. What does this Jeep do? It scurries away into a building. What building? A hospital, a daycare, a apartment building. And now they tell the Israelis, okay, come get us. So what does Israel do at this point, right? If they go and attack Hamas rocket launchers, right, then, they might end up killing civilians, which they don't want to do. They don't do that, then 2 hours later, they go back and launch more rockets against Israel. So that's part of the difficulty here in dealing with this. That's what you're dealing with, right? You're literally dealing with people who are using their own people as human shields and then putting Israel in a place where, go ahead, attack us. And this is not done by accident. This is calculated. This is calculated to try to create, create blood, right? So they want then the global community to then condemn Israel. Oh, how dare you attack our civilians? And believe it or not, that's worked. There's an entire movement called the BDS movement. I don't know if you've heard of it before. It's all about boycotting Israel and not allowing people to sell things to Israel. And it's very popular on a lot of colleges. It's very much popular in the far left wing of American politics in the United States. And I'll be very clear on this. This is nothing more than a ruse for Jew hatred. It is an attempt to single out the Jewish people to suffocate their existence by saying, let's boycott them and destroy them, all because Israel is trying to defend themselves against these attacks. And, it's kind of a shocking situation, but there it is. And people sometimes say, oh, BDS is not anti-Israel and not anti-Zionist and not anti-Jewish. It very much is, and you can find a lot of articles kind of in documents showing that if you really want to look into it a bit. So, that's just kind of the sad reality. And, people have asked me, is there ever going to be peace? And I think there will be. There'll be peace when the Palestinians are willing to say, we want to put down our weapons to have peace, and we're willing to have a governing body that wants that. I put it this way: if Israel puts down its weapons tomorrow, what happens? Well, pretty much all of Israel is going to be annihilated. If the Palestinians put down their weapons tomorrow and say, we're done fighting, there's peace the next day, right? And Israel has proven that because they've done peace with Jordan, they've done peace with Egypt, they've given up land before. So that's kind of this kind of unfortunate situation of where it is. So there's that. There's a TV series called Fauda. It's on Netflix. It's pretty intense, and it kind of goes through this whole conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and there are these TV shows. I don't know if anybody's seen it, and it's kind of no hold bar. I mean, they show the dirtiness of everything. They don't portray Israel as this wonderful, always doing everything right. They don't. But they're also very blunt on what the Arabs are doing, using human shields and the terrorist attacks, and so it's very raw. It's very brutal. It's gonna, you're gonna be at the edge of your seat watching this. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's a good kind of Netflix series if you're interested in this stuff and you want kind of a show on it, kind of TV type show on it. So anyway, so that's one of the big things going on there, and it's unfortunate. I think most people who are Palestinians want peace. Most people who are Israel want peace, right? But the leadership right now of the Palestinian community is just not there, and that's where the real sticking point is. Other issues that are important between Israel and its Arab neighbors during the Obama years, Iran's developing nuclear weapons. This has become a great concern for Israel. In fact, Israel was very concerned about a deal Iran made with President Obama made with Iran, where Iran was given billions of dollars, actually. And Israel was very upset with President Obama over this because they don't trust that Iran will actually not build nuclear weapons. So that was a big issue during the Obama years. During the President Trump years, one of the key things that happened in terms of Israel is that the United States recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, something that pretty much every president had said they were going to do. But President Trump was the one who actually did it, and we actually moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So that was a pretty momentous event. President Trump was also the first sitting president to go to the Wailing Wall. So those are things. It's kind of interesting because if obviously with our modern history and our politics, President Trump is a very polarizing figure. There are people who love him and there are people who hate him. But it's interesting in Israel. A lot of Israelis really like President Trump, which is kind of interesting. But obviously he's very polarizing in the United States. He also negotiated a couple big peace treaties with Arab nations, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, all of that in 2020. So, for again, as polarizing a figure he is in the United States, in the Middle East, he's actually had a few pretty good achievements in terms of being peace treaty. I actually kind of I know quite a few people who hate President Trump, and at the same time, they even acknowledge, well, yeah, at least he did that right. So even people who don't like him oftentimes have to acknowledge that he's been very supportive of the state of Israel and trying to bring peace. In terms of the Palestinians, there's unfortunately been no progress on that. So it's a struggle. It's a hard thing to solve. Anybody who can, like I said, anybody who can bring peace to any nations in this area is having a pretty big accomplishment. So that's I'd love to leave you with, hey, everything is great and lovely in the region, but it's not. I mean, yes, there's some nice peace treaties which are nice, and I think slowly as people realize Israel's not going anywhere as a state, they'll get it. And, the Palestinians, if they, want to flourish, I mean, the Palestinian population does, is growing in numbers. They have schools, they have hospitals, they have infrastructure. They have the ability to create a very nice self-governing society, right? It's not as though Israel's going into these areas, finding Palestinians to go round up and kill or anything. They're letting them develop and just don't attack us with rockets, and everything's going to be all good. And so that's where the struggles begin. So A lot of stuff to think about, a lot of things to process there. Obviously, for a lot of people, this is sometimes controversial in terms of, understanding the whole picture, and especially for people who are from that area. Sometimes they don't like all the, the specific realities of what's going on, but sometimes reality isn't pretty, and you have to deal with that. And yes, has Israel oftentimes been very aggressive dealing with the Palestinians? Yes, and I think it's important to note that. But I think it's also important to note the reasons in the background and the timeline as to how and why all that happens, right? Israel doesn't bulldoze houses of Palestinian civilians because they want to. They did it because, a terrorist attack hit them. So as long as you know the whole picture, you can all have your own opinions and thoughts, and that's the wonderful thing I think about how college should be, is you should all have your free thoughts and your free ideas, but the facts of what happens and why it happens is what I want you to know. Your own thoughts and ideas behind it are perfectly fine. Everyone has their own, own opinions on things. So anyways, I hope you found all that interesting. It's a big series of lectures, I know, and then we have one more big topic to cover in this class, and that's going to, of course, be the story of Afghanistan and the events leading to 9/11, a topic I used to not cover when I started to teach, but it's been many years since I started to teach, so obviously now it's an important issue as well. So we'll get to that in our next lecture. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.